Good morning. My name is Nigel Ayres, and I run Expat Network, who are hosting today's webinar. Welcome, and I hope you'll find it useful. I would like to start with just my apologies. We have a very experienced set of speakers today, knowledgeable panelists who will help to guide you through the requirements to become resident in Portugal and to find your new home and deal with the practicalities of the move. You can at any time send a question, and we'll try to put as many as we can at the end of each session. There'll also be a Q&A at the end where we can cover some of the points that we may have missed. We'll also hold on to any questions that are not covered today and try to get an answer to you after the event, or can put you in touch with someone who can answer your question. As well as the online event, we've been planning to hold an event in the Algarve in Portugal in September. These events were intended to give you a chance not only to plan but progress your move to Portugal. However, with the UK government's unpredictable approach to air bridges, quarantine and SEO advice, the events will need to be reviewed. Clearly, those who want to move before the end of the transition period will need to decide whether they're able to travel to Portugal. If you would be interested in attending an event in the Algarve, please register your interest on the Expat Network website, and we'll keep you advised as our plans develop. So, as well as the events, as holding these webinars, we also have the Expat Network portal with a great deal of information on there. And we have these three guides, which you may find useful. First of all, Guide to Living in Portugal, Moving Abroad checklist, and then a financial action checklist to go through the points you may need to consider before you leave, if you are a British expatriate or will be a British expatriate. So we will be starting today with Lena Gouveia, who is a lawyer in Portugal, and she'll give an explanation of the requirements to gain residency before the end of the year to qualify for the ongoing benefits that provides you. Lena Gouveia from Ibex Insurance will then take you through the arrangements for accessing the state healthcare system in Portugal, as well as the options for taking private healthcare, which can be required for residents. Gavin Scott of Blevins Franks will then give you an insight into the Portuguese tax system and go through arrangements for your pension and financial planning considerations, or what you might need to think about before you leave the UK. We will then move on to property, and Lewis de Silva of Portugal Senior Living will talk you through the different areas of Portugal and give you an insight into the property market there. Edwina will then explain how the conveyancing process works in Portugal, followed by Celia Moss of Algarve Assistance, who will take you through how to obtain a mortgage, the rules when renting out your property, and the rules and arrangements if you plan to take a long-term rental rather than buy. She will also explain some of the practicalities as we settle into life, such as getting your car registered and obtaining a driving license. Finally, Robin Haynes of Currency Index will explain the very important considerations for transferring money abroad and managing exchange risks. At the end, then, there will be a general question and answer session, picking up any questions submitted during the webinar. So, we asked various questions to you about your plans when you registered for the event, so we can ensure the webinar was directed at your needs. With the transition period ending on 31st December, we assume most will be wanting to beat the deadline, but perhaps surprisingly, the majority of you are not planning to move until next year, or indeed later than that. In terms of why we're moving, the majority here are moving for retirement. Relatively smaller number buying simply for a holiday home, and some of those, no doubt, will be doing so ready for their retirement. There's also an element of you who are planning to work abroad, and that reflects the fact that young people also move to Portugal. In terms of who they're with, the majority there significantly with a partner, relatively smaller number with travelling alone, and 9% travelling with family, either children or adult family. In terms of where, Algarve is by far the most popular, but quite a significant number looking to move to the Lisbon area, and the Silver Coast is obviously picking up some interest as well. Rent or buy, that's often one of the key considerations when moving abroad, and here we've got 3/4 of you looking to buy. Unusually, 47% more than are directly buying are renting rather than and then buying. Sorry, we generally recommend that as it gives you an opportunity to make sure you're moving to the right area, getting to know the prices of properties so that you get ultimately the right property in the right location at the right price. I think also the fact that we are moving towards the end of this transition period, and with the complications of COVID and so on, there may be a greater number of you considering renting before you buy. Long-term renting, 15% of you planning to rent long-term, and that's what I do in Spain. So it is obviously a valid option. So we will now move on to the first session, where we have Lena Gouveia, who will talk us through the issues around residence. And so if I can just ask Lena to join us. Hello, Lena, welcome.
Hello, good morning. How are you?
I'm fine. Right, so let's just sort of go first of all into why do people need to apply for Portuguese residence, and when do they need to do it?
Well, people should apply for Portuguese residence if they intend to stay in Portugal for a prolonged period of time. Ideally, if they are intending to stay any longer than 90 days, they should be applying for residence within the 30 days following those 90 days. You know, if it's your intention to stay in Portugal, then yes, you legally need to apply for residence.
Okay, and how long does that residence last? Is this temporary, or can they apply for permanent residence?
So the initial residence application is essentially a registration as a European citizen in Portugal, and that lasts for 5 years. Okay, you would, as I say, apply for that within the 30 days following the initial 90 days in Portugal, although you could potentially apply beforehand if you wanted to, if it is your intention from the outset to stay in Portugal.
And where do they apply for residence, and how long does it take to get their residence?
So residence is applied for at the local city hall or city council of the place where you intend to take up residency. You would usually show up at the city hall nowadays with an appointment because of COVID-19, with all of the documents, and they would, in most places, issue you with the document that same day.
Right, and so is there much of a backlog of people applying as a result of COVID, or are they able to get appointments?
At the moment, you are able to get an appointment fairly quickly. Again, I believe because of COVID-19, they've had to really restructure at the local city councils in terms of appointments, and you know, they seem to be functioning fairly well, at least locally to me. I can't really speak for other areas in Portugal, but in the Algarve, the sense is that you're able to get an appointment fairly quickly and get this matter dealt with fairly easily.
Okay, and the requirements, are they sort of consistently applied across the country, or does it vary from town hall to town hall?
It can vary from town hall to town hall. You have your essential requirements, which are obviously showing up with your passport, a completed form, which most city councils will make available on their website, proof of address and health insurance. Although some city halls do request additional requirements, such as proof of how you intend to support yourself, for example. Ideally, what you want to do is really get in touch with someone who can assist a lawyer, for example, to make sure that when you're making your appointment and you're showing up at that city hall for that appointment, you have everything that that specific city hall is going to request.
Right, okay. And so overall, so what is the documentation that you need when you apply?
Again, you would need your valid form of ID. You would need to sign a declaration of honour that you're either employed, have a business in Portugal, or have sufficient resources to support yourself, proof of address, and health insurance.
Right. And you're saying health insurance is required, and one of the audits who is under the age of 65 asked how they obtain medical cover, and are there any special conditions required?
Legislation is always evolving in regards to this. So I would recommend that anyone who's applying for residency get in touch with a Portuguese insurance broker. And I believe that we have a speaker following myself who may be able to assist with this matter as well. So ideally, you want to speak to the insurance broker, make sure that you're obtaining a policy that is good for your personal circumstances and that also covers what current legislation is requesting.
Right. So for those who are of retirement age, they can use Form S1. Could you explain what this is and how they obtain one?
Yes, so the S1 form is a document that can be applied for in the UK with the National Health System in certain circumstances, which allows you to receive state health care in Portugal, which is paid by the UK. Not everyone is entitled to this, so you really want to be speaking to the NHS Overseas Healthcare Services to ensure that you meet the requirements to apply for this form. And should you meet those requirements, then this will obviously assist you in Portugal in receiving state healthcare.
Right. And I've also been asked by one of our audience whether it's possible to get a lawyer to do most of the applications for them, or do they need to go to the authorities firstly? I mean, I think in the circumstances of COVID, that's a question that comes up a lot.
I would recommend that you have the assistance of a lawyer to make sure that you are complying with all of the documents and requirements that are needed to apply for residency. You do, however, always have to appear in person at least once before the authorities. You must apply in person. It's not possible to apply by way of a power of attorney.
Right, okay. So if they don't speak Portuguese, is it possible to work, or is it practical terms necessary to make sure you have a Portuguese speaker with you?
Yes, I mean, if you have a lawyer assisting you in this process, your lawyer would most definitely speak English and be able to assist with the translation. I think it's helpful to have someone who can translate, just to make sure that obviously all of the information that is going to and through from the city council regarding this application is completely understood. You know, it's not necessary to have a Portuguese speaker, but it's definitely helpful. Depending on where you apply for the residency, so the location in Portugal, you're more likely or less likely to have English-speaking staff at the city hall.
Right. So if, well, I would say if the UK leaves the EU, when they leave the EU, well, I mean, technically they have, but will residency still apply?
At the moment, the indication that we have is that for British citizens applying for residency in Portugal, that the requirements are to stay as is for all Europeans up until the end of the year. We've had very little guidance on what's going to happen post 31st of December 2020. So I would definitely say that if some of our audience today are thinking of coming to Portugal, this year would be better for you. You know, at least we know that it's a fairly simple process for Europeans. I'm hoping that given everything that's happened this year, and obviously with the issue of people not being able to travel out to Portugal, that there will be an extension on this deadline. But so far, we've had no indication whatsoever. We're still waiting for further information, really. Okay.
Talking here about residents in Portugal, what about tax residents? Is that the same thing? When you become Portuguese residents, you automatically become tax residents?
Yes, yes. Once you become a resident, you have an obligation to notify the tax office of your change of address to Portugal, and therefore you become tax resident. This means that you should then declare your worldwide income in Portugal and start paying your taxes in Portugal.
And we will be going into more about the tax with Gavin Scott of Blevins Franks later. So the other issue that comes up is residence and citizenship. What's the requirements to apply for Portuguese citizenship, and what advantages does it give over permanent residence?
I mean, the main difference between residence and citizenship is that as a citizen, you can apply for a passport. You are entitled to vote in the general elections in Portugal. By obtaining the Portuguese passport, you are then entitled to travel within the Schengen area. There are many countries where you don't require a visa to travel to. Whilst as a resident, this is a status. Okay, it doesn't give you all of those rights that a citizen would get. In terms of requirements to obtain citizenship in Portugal, you need to have been legally resident in Portugal for at least 6 years, be older than 18 years of age, and know the Portuguese language sufficiently. In terms of proving that you know the Portuguese language, there are several ways you can do this, namely by way of a language test. You would apply for citizenship through your local civil registry, or you can do it by post to a relevant department. You would send a number of documents with your application, such as your birth certificate, a letter addressed to the Ministry of Justice with your complete name, date of birth, marital status, your parents' names, your profession, your address, the countries where you have been a resident prior to being resident in Portugal, a certificate to show that you've taken this language test, as well as a criminal report for each country that you have lived in from when you were 16 years of age. In terms of costs, at the moment for applying for citizenship, this has a fee of €250.
Thank you. So for those people who are perhaps thinking about a holiday home rather than living here full time, if they spend less than 6 months in Portugal a year, do they still have to become a Portuguese resident?
So you can spend up to 90 days in Portugal in each 183 days without having the obligation to become resident. If you wanted to spend more than 90 days in one go, then yes, after the 90 days, you have the obligation within the next 30 to become a resident.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for that, Edwina, and we'll hear from you later when we talk about the buying process in Portugal. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes. So next on the agenda we have Lena Gouveia from Ibex Insurance. And
Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay. Yes, apologies. Yes, sorry about that.
Good morning. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I believe we can.
Okay, excellent. Well, good morning to all, and thank you, Nigel, for inviting us to be part of your webinar, and welcome to everyone that's seeing this webinar as well. Before I start my presentation on national health and private health, I'd just like to introduce Ibex. We're an international insurance broker established in 2000 in Spain, Portugal, and Gibraltar. We're the largest insurance broker to the expat community in the Iberian Peninsula, and we've got 12 retail offices over in Spain and Portugal. We've got 9 retail offices in the south of Spain, and we've got 2 offices in Portugal. Besides medical insurance, we also offer, let me just go there. We also offer several types of other insurances, from car insurance, household insurance, pet insurance, so everything that you might need when you move over to Portugal. I'll start off by talking about the healthcare in Portugal. The healthcare system in Portugal consists of 3 different coexisting systems. So you can access the healthcare in Portugal through the National Health Service, which is very similar to the NHS. It's called the Serviço Nacional de Saúde, the SNS. Certain occupations also have access to the health insurance through health insurance schemes, such as the police sector, the public sector, the police, the military, and banking, which I don't think that would be part of any of the people that would be moving over, but it's always useful to know. And obviously you can access healthcare in Portugal by having a private health insurance. So how do you access the national healthcare in Portugal? You can do that by 3 means. Either use the Portuguese National Health System service as a resident, or using the European Health Insurance Card for temporary stays, or by using, as Edwina said, your S1 form, which you can obtain from the UK. So how do you register for the National Health System? Firstly, you have to become a resident. If you're coming over to Portugal to work, you'll have to obtain what we call a social security number. You have to obtain this whether you're working for an employer or if you're self-employed. If you're coming over as a pensioner, you can get the SN1 form in the UK. And that also has to be registered on the at the Social Security Office. Once you get the Social Security number, you can then register at the local health centre, which we call the Centro de Saúde. And in order to do so, you will need your residence certificate, your passport, your tax identification number, in other words, your fiscal number, and your Social Security number or S1 form. Once you register at the local health centre, you will be given a national health number called the Cartão de Número do Utente. So with this number, you can access the national health system and also access medication at lower costs. Obviously, if you want to deal with this, we personally don't do it because we're insurance companies, but you can always contact either a lawyer or Algarve Assistance and speak to Celia, who will be speaking to you later on in this webinar. So the National Health System is funded through the general taxation and the social security contributions paid by working residents. The residents, when they registered on the National Health Care, they have to still pay a small contribution, so it's not totally free, towards the consultations, the hospital treatment and prescriptions. However, there are exceptions. Certain groups do not pay anything, such as pregnant ladies and vulnerable and low-earning groups. You have to be aware that dental costs are normally not covered under the National Health System, so they're normally private. The quality of care in the National Health is quite high. Obviously, unfortunately, there are still some hiccups, but that's not too bad. So I'm a true believer that although you will be part of the National Health System, it is still quite important to have some sort of private health care, access to private health care. And the reason being is because you'll have faster access to medical treatments. At times on the National Health, you might wait quite a while in order to see a doctor. And if you need to be referred to a specialist, you will still need to go through your normal general practitioner in order to get a referral to a specialist. Whereas if you do it through the private healthcare, you can go directly to a specialist and seen to straight away. Obviously, on the private sector, you also have convenient appointment times, whereas through the National Health, the appointment times are quite restricted. On the private healthcare, once again, you've got a choice of a medical practitioner and hospital, whereas if you go through the state system, you are appointed a family doctor, and he will then appoint the specialist that he recommends. And obviously, if you're non-resident or if you don't have any access to SNS, it's always convenient to have private medical insurance. As a broker, we work with many leading insurers, and we try and find the best one that tailors your needs. We work with international companies as well as national companies. You will notice that the international policies have got higher levels of cover. They normally are in their millions, their overall limits, whereas the Portuguese policies are normally in their thousands. Portuguese policies are basically for Portugal only. They do have a slight international medical cover for emergencies only, but they're basically for Portugal only. Whereas the international policies, you can choose from worldwide cover, including or excluding USA, or European cover. Because of these differences, obviously the Portuguese policies, the premiums on Portuguese policy premiums are normally lower than those on the international policies. But on the international policies, obviously you've got free choice of any medical provider worldwide or in Europe. Whereas on the Portuguese policies, you're normally restricted to the medical providers that are part of the network. On the international policies, you normally, for outpatient treatment, you pay the full amount and then you request the reimbursement. The convenience of the Portuguese policies is that if you use the network, you only pay the co-payments, which is normally for a consultation, either 15 euros or 18 euros, depending on the policy you choose. You have to be aware that when you take out a Portuguese policy, you will have standard waiting periods for all treatments. Normally they range between 2 months and 3 months and are sometimes extended to a year for specific treatments. Whereas on the international policies, you don't have any waiting periods, an exception for health screenings, which is normally a year. You also have to be aware that obviously by moving to Portugal, and if you take out a Portuguese policies, the policy documentation will be in Portuguese. Some insurance companies are already starting to issue documentation in English, but most of them will only be in Portuguese, which obviously doesn't happen with the international policies, which documentation is all available in English. The other major difference between the Portuguese policy and the international policy is that there is limited cancer treatment on Portuguese policies, whereas on the international policies, cancer treatment is covered in full up to the total capital insured. One thing you also have to be aware of, which unfortunately I didn't add on my table, is that there are age restrictions in order to take out medical insurance, and that you have to be aware of. Normally the Portuguese policies, you can only take out up to the age of 64. Whereas the international policies may vary between 74 and 80. There is one Portuguese insurance company which there has no age limit, which is a French-based insurance policy company which came to Portugal a few years ago. So that could be an option for the people that are thinking of retiring in Portugal. So this is just an overall summary of the covers available on the insurance companies we offer. As you can see, the international companies, AXA, a la carte, Boop and Morgan Price, normally the overall covers are quite high in their millions. Whereas if you compare to the Portuguese insurance companies, they're in their thousands. So within the Portuguese insurance companies, cover can vary from 15,000 euros to 1 million, depending on the insurance company you choose from. So the MGen, the one on the top of this page, is the one that's got no limit on no age limit in order to adhere to the policy. So how do you pay for the medical expenses? So depending on the policy you choose, you can either have a reimbursement policy, which is normally what happens on the international companies. So with outpatient treatment, you pay for the full amount and then you request the reimbursement. Whereas on the Portuguese insurance companies, you're normally given a card. You go to the medical providers that are part of the network, and you only pay a co-payment at the time you receive the treatment, which for consultations may vary between 15 and 18 euros, and for medical examinations you may just pay 10% of of the cost. When taking out a medical insurance, you can opt for 3 different types of underwriting. This means this is very important with regards to if you've got pre-existing medical conditions. So normally the insurance companies do a full medical underwriting, which means that when you fill in the application form, you also have to fill in a medical questionnaire. And anything pre-existing will be excluded. And this especially if you take medication or receive treatment for an ongoing condition. There are certain insurance companies which you can opt for a moratorium, which means that you don't need to fill out any medical questionnaire, but you have to be aware that any condition or symptom that you have suffered in the 5 years prior to the policy, you will need to go through a 2-year waiting period for the policy to start for those specific conditions. So for example, say if you've had a hip replacement, say 4 years ago, and you start a policy today, you will have to wait for 2 years without receiving any treatment or checkups for that condition until that problem will be covered on the policy. And the last option would be the medical history disregarded, which is another type of underwriting, which is the most expensive one, and not all companies offer. So no conditions will be excluded from this policy. However, medically history disregarded underwriting is only available on company schemes or when you transfer from a company scheme to an individual policy. It is the most expensive kind of underwriting available, and normally is only available on the international policies. So this is just a small summary of how you can access the private care and the national care. If you require any further information, you can always give me a call or send me an email, and I'll be pleased to send you some information.
Gavin, hello.
Good morning, Nigel.
Morning. Right, well, we're just going to cover now the financial side of things, and perhaps you could start by giving us a little background about yourself and Blevins Franks.
Sure. So I'm the senior partner at Blevins Franks here in Portugal. I've been here for 20 years, Nigel, building the office and our client base here. We provide tax-led financial advice. So we're tax and wealth planners. Typically, our clients will be coming from the UK, probably in line with the numbers that you got in your survey. So predominantly coming here to retire across Portugal, Silver Coast, Cascais, Algarve. And we'll give advice that ties the two systems together. So while people have been very used to saving in UK ISAs and funding their pensions, they're now maybe looking to draw down on that capital, and we'll lead them through the way to do that tax efficiently from a Portuguese perspective. And then importantly, thinking about having the right money in the right hands at the right time, and thinking about succession. So how do we make sure that our money passes to our heirs as tax efficiently, and also as simply as possible at that time, bearing in mind that people will often be dealing with two different jurisdictions, the Portuguese rules on the one side when they've moved here, and the home country, predominantly the UK, looking back at how those two regimes fit together.
Okay, so people moving to Portugal will have heard about possible tax benefits. Can you outline the non-habitual tax regime and how that works?
Sure. Well, 10 years ago, the Portuguese looked at their economy here, and like many countries, they have a shrinking population. And what they were looking to do was to encourage initially working people, what they termed high value occupations. And they wanted these people to come and work in Portugal, and they offered a capped income tax rate of 20%. That was then expanded within the first year to cover people coming to retire as well. And this year we've had a change to that, which says that if you're drawing down foreign pension and you're receiving that in Portugal, then rather than it being entirely exempt as it was up until April of this year, you'll now have a fixed rate of 10% on that income. It's not an overly complicated system, but you do have to make sure that you've been through all of the detail around it to understand which forms of income and which form of gains will be exempt here in Portugal. But it runs for a 10-year period, so people coming to retire will know that they've got a fixed 10-year period whereby their pensions will be taxed at a maximum of 10%, and that other forms of income and gains may also be exempt.
Okay, and so who qualifies for this tax scheme, and how do they apply for it?
Well, if I start with your first question, who qualifies? Anybody who hasn't lived in Portugal in the previous 5 years, but has the right to come and live here, qualifies for the regime. So that's not complicated. And the second part, how do you apply for it? I think Edwina ran through the process of getting a tax number, getting your residencia, and then the final part of that will be you'll use your lawyer or accountant to make the application for the non-habitual residence tax overlay. So it's a straightforward application, and anybody who hasn't been tax resident in the previous 5 years can apply for it.
Okay, and so is it possible to be, a question here from somebody in the audience, is it possible to be tax resident in 2 countries, so Portugal and the UK at the same time, so spending, say, 6 months in each?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Nigel. So technically, yes, it is possible. So if you think, again, Edwina was talking earlier about anybody spending more than 183 days in Portugal would automatically be deemed to be tax resident here. However, you may find that the statutory residence test in the UK, if you spent more than, say, 90 days in the UK, would deem you to be tax resident there. Fortunately, there's a double tax treaty that exists that then says, okay, the 2 tax authorities will have a look and determine through a series of tiebreakers exactly where which country has the primary claim to receive the tax. And then secondly, the double tax treaty will ensure that the same income or gain isn't taxed twice. So you'll only pay the highest rate that exists between the 2 countries. And yeah, an example of that might be that if you've already paid £100 of tax in the UK on a particular income, but you're tax resident in Portugal and the tax rate in Portugal was 110, you'd pay the additional 10 in Portugal, getting full credit for the 100 you've already paid in the UK. So the double tax treaty protects us in that way.
Okay, thank you. So when people are planning their move to Portugal, are there any other issues? Are there any issues from a sort of financial tax perspective they should think about before they make the move, or can they wait until they get here? And does Brexit affect your answer?
Yes, definitely Brexit affects the answer. But in any case, I would say that if you're aware and you're planning to make a move, then planning is the key word. Start the conversation early with your advisors to determine what steps you need to take and at which point in the process do you need to take them. So it may be, for example, if I give you the example of ISAs in the UK, individual savings accounts, which are tax-free in the UK, but not in Portugal. So it may be that you want to encash your ISAs in the UK because that would be a tax-free process in the UK, but it would be taxed if you'd already arrived in Portugal. So you want to look at the sequence of events and start that planning now. Brexit brings into focus the fact that from the 31st of December, the UK will no longer be in the transition period. They're already out of Europe, and in which case a number of things will no longer apply. So Currently, anybody moving from the UK enjoys the free movement of goods, capital, people and services. And of course, it's our capital that we might want to look at and say, would there be tax consequences, in particular things like pension funds. If you want to move your pension out of the UK in its entirety and you wanted to move it to a scheme in Canada or New Zealand or Australia, currently you would pay an overseas transfer charge of 25% on that money moving. That transfer charge does not apply where the money is moving and the beneficiary is moving within the European Union. So again, if you're thinking about a move this time before the end of this year or even into the early part of next year, you should already be having a conversation about your pensions, where they should be in the future, should they remain in the UK, should they be in a base where you can be thinking in euro terms. And again, that will be an important consideration, not just for pension, but for other assets, capital assets, saying should we be thinking about the denomination of our assets, of our savings. Because as we know, Nigel, I say over the last 20 years, I've seen the currency rates, and I know you'll talk about currency later on, but I've seen currency move from a pound buying €1.50 all the way down to parity. If you've got an amount of capital sitting in the UK, that exchange rate movement can decimate your wealth by, in those examples, by a third. It can decimate your income by a third, it can decimate your capital by a third. So again, it's that kind of planning that you want to say, well, we think we can afford to live in Portugal with the assets that we have. What effects would currency have and what might come with Brexit?
Okay, thank you. We have a series of questions now that people have sent in before the webinar, so I'll just take those one at a time. The first one, do I have to spend the full 10 years of the non-habitual residence period in Portugal? What if I return to the UK before then?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. A lot of people ask me, Nigel, about that 10-year period, and they say, am I making a 10-year commitment? And the answer is no. It's just a tax overlay. So if you come to Portugal and you spend years 1 to 3 in Portugal, and then you move away for years 4 and 5, you can come back, but the clock has been ticking and you'll now do 6, 7 and 8 back in Portugal. So your movement is entirely unfettered. It's just that the tax overlay lasts for that 10-year period and it won't be extended if you move away and come back again.
Right, okay. The next one here is, my wife and I have individual savings accounts and personal pensions that they plan to use to fund their retirement. Will these retain their tax status when we're living in Portugal?
So let me break that down. You've got individual savings accounts was the first one and pensions the second one. ISAs are tax efficient in the UK, but because they're not being taxed in the UK, they will be taxed in Portugal. So you want to think about the planning around those before you make the move. Pensions, on the other hand, they will continue to roll up in the pension structures themselves entirely free of tax. I'm assuming that these are personal pensions rather than company schemes. And then under the non-habitual residence rules, they will pay a flat rate of 10% tax as they're being drawn down, and that won't matter whether they remain in the UK or whether you move them overseas to Europe if they follow you to Portugal. But it just shows that there's different thinking to be had around. We can't just assume because you've got the non-habitual overlay that everything becomes tax-free. A number of things may be tax exempt or they may be taxed at 10%, and other things you'll need to consider like your ISAs.
Okay, thanks. The next one, I understand from researching on the internet that Portugal has no inheritance tax. If I leave my estate to my children, will they inherit tax-free?
Yes, again, that's quite a technical question because if you think in the UK we have common law and in Portugal we have civil law that's grown out of Napoleonic Code, and the basic differences are that in the UK we have, after our death, we have an entity that we know as the estate, and that our estate has the same legal structure as an individual, as a company, and is treated in exactly the same way. That doesn't exist under civil law. Either you own the asset or you don't own the asset. So under civil law in Portugal, the asset passes immediately to the beneficiaries, and the beneficiaries pay a gifts tax rather than the estate being charged an inheritance tax. Assets passing from parents to children are exempt, so there's no gifts tax on that. So technically speaking, there's no inheritance tax in Portugal. However, the thing that British nationals will have to be careful of is that even having left the UK, if they continue to be deemed to be domiciled in the UK, they'll still be subject to UK inheritance tax. So again, how those things link together just needs a little bit of planning and thinking to say, how do we think in terms of succession in one column and tax in another column? So we say, well, it's okay, I can leave my assets to my chosen beneficiaries, but how will they be taxed? And again, that's one that we can help with, and that you should seek advice to make sure that you understand the effects from both your country of origin and now your country of residence.
Okay. So the next one, I have just sold my UK home and I was about to rent a villa in Portugal with a view to buying a property on the Silver Coast. I have a number of different pension schemes, private, company and government, and my UK advisor recommends transferring them all into one SIP. Is that the best thing to do?
I would slow down and I would be careful. And the question I'd be asking my UK advisor is, what are the tax consequences of those moves, and how will the UK advisor intend to continue to provide advice once you've moved to Portugal? So I'd make sure that you're dealing with a firm that has that cross-border expertise. In terms of moving all your pensions into one SIP, that may be the starting point of a consideration, but if you're moving earlier, then you might want to think about where that SIP should be based. Is that a SIP in the UK, or is it the pensions equivalent overseas? So there's a bit of additional information to take that, again, I would just check and make sure that your UK advisor is up to speed on that, and that actually he has the licenses to be able to continue to advise you after the 1st of January. So there's quite a bit of thinking to be done around that one. You mentioned something else in there, Nigel, not just pensions. What was the other part of the question?
Well, it was private, company and government pensions, I think.
Yes, no, very important. So government pensions, if you think self-invested pensions and private company schemes, so I'm thinking British Rail, British Telecom, whoever these might be, the Gas Board, all of these private schemes will be due to be taxed in Portugal under the double taxation agreement. However, government schemes, UK government schemes, I'm thinking things like teachers' pensions, civil service, these kind of pensions will always be taxed in the UK. So again, it's a case of saying, well, how do we make sure in those cases that we're maximising our UK allowances, which we'll continue to have, and then how do we maximise the position from a Portuguese sense on your personal pensions and your ISAs and so on. So yes, a very important question. Government schemes will continue to be taxed in the UK at source.
Okay, and the next, this person plans to move to Portugal next year when their UK state pension starts, but all of their personal pensions, SIP, will be in sterling, and their expenditure will obviously be in euros. Is there anything they can do to eliminate the currency risk?
Yeah, there are a number of things that they might consider. So within UK schemes, you might consider how you could access euro denominated funds. Can you have a euro cash account within your pension, or do you need to move it overseas to be able to think about balancing these things off? If you've got UK annuities, government pensions, then these are always going to come as your state pension will in sterling. And so again, you need to be thinking about the currency position there and how you would be affected if the currency moved by so many percent in either direction, if it moves in your benefit or against. But really importantly from a financial planning perspective is how do you try to mitigate as much risk as you can? So if you're able to mitigate currency risk and balance and match your liabilities with your assets, then I would think that would be a great starting point for anybody.
Okay, thank you. And a topical one here, this person is from the UK but has been living and working in Hong Kong for the last 7 years. Their aim is to retire to Portugal in the next 18 months. And they've several rental properties in the UK. They've also built up capital in a retirement fund provided by their employer in Hong Kong, which they can cash when they retire. What planning do they need to do or consider?
Okay, I think the first thing for any advisor is to hold their hand up and say, I cannot give any advice on the Hong Kong aspect of the planning that they're doing at the moment. However, we can talk about the Portuguese side. And so thinking about the opportunities that come along, George Osborne in 2015 introduced capital gains tax on UK property where people were selling from overseas. So regardless of whether our viewer is still resident in Hong Kong or they've moved to Portugal, in the past they would have had no capital gains tax on the sale of their properties. Today they've only got capital gains tax from the 6th of April 2015 till today. So any gain that has arisen during that period. From a Portuguese perspective, that gain would be exempt from tax in Portugal under the non-habitual residence regime because it could have been taxed in the UK, and in fact there may be some tax to pay. But if our viewer here has held these properties for some period of time and the gains were made prior to 2015, then there's a huge opportunity moving into retirement in particular to divest themselves of an illiquid asset, property, and to think about holding their assets in a more liquid and currency efficient form for their retirement in Portugal. So it opens up a big question to sit down and look at holding property in the UK. Are there advantages to be able even just to recapitalize and think about buying property again, but again recapitalizing and washing out the previous gain. The next one was capital, and there are a number of things that you can do with capital. There are a number of different platforms to use. There are tax wrappers that you can use for Portugal that will allow your assets to roll up entirely free of income and gains, and maybe you'll pay an element of tax as you draw down on those funds, which would be in proportion to the gains that you've made. You might also use the non-habitual residence regime to ensure that your assets, if they're on a platform, that they're generating more income than gains, so gear your portfolios towards income. The income would be tax efficient under the non-habitual residence regime, but the gains wouldn't be. So again, making sure that your assets have got the right balance of income to gains. What is it that you're targeting for in the future, and how will you use these assets? It's a very personal conversation to sit down with people and understand how they're best going to get the most out of the assets that they've built up over the years. So from this individual living in Hong Kong, it will present a lot of opportunity around their pension planning, and their capital can be structured tax efficiently for a Portuguese perspective. It doesn't mean that things will be tax free, but it just means they'll be tax efficient in the same way as you would do UK planning using ISAs and pensions and other tax favoured schemes, national insurance savings.
Okay. So the next one is my wife and I are selling the UK family home and buying an apartment in the Algarve. They'll be left with spare capital, which along with their pensions they plan to live off. Will Portugal tax them on the capital when I bring it into the country, and how should they invest it in Portugal?
Okay, so very similar to the last question. There's no tax on capital. You're free to bring capital into the country. You can move it around the European Union if you decide to have a bank account or some other using some other insurance institution or whatever in Luxembourg or Dublin or wherever. You can move your capital around, and the Portuguese will not tax your capital. There are no exit taxes leaving the UK, and in this case you're talking about somebody selling their principal residence, their main home. So again, they would have no tax on it in the UK and no tax in Portugal. And they would use the same structure as our friend from Hong Kong. They'd sit down and have a conversation and would say, how are we going to use this capital now? How much of our pension do we need to supplement? Do we have to target for a particular element of income to cover your fixed costs? And then what are your discretionary costs? What sort of holidays do you want to go on from here? Although we quite often find that, and a lot of us working here in Portugal take our holidays in Portugal because it's a fantastic place to be.
Okay. Another one here. I've recently spoken with my UK financial advisor about my proposed move to Portugal, and she advised me to retain my ISAs as they are tax-free. She says the excess capital from my UK house sale should be invested into an Isle of Man offshore life insurance policy. Is all this correct and the best advice?
Sadly, no. As I mentioned earlier, ISAs in particular, we think, we've come from the UK and we say, oh, they're tax-free. Yes, they're tax-free in the UK, but they will be taxed when you come to Portugal, even under the non-habitual residence regime. And then this particular question is coming from somebody who the UK advisor has said that an offshore insurance bond is an offshore insurance bond, and therefore the Isle of Man is a good jurisdiction. The Isle of Man is a good jurisdiction, and if you were setting up an offshore insurance bond as a UK resident, I'd say it's perfect because the insurance company there is familiar with the UK tax rules, and they will prepare the correct paperwork in the form of a chargeable event certificate if you have a tax liability. The Isle of Man insurance companies, I'm not familiar with any that are able to provide a certificate that complies with the Portuguese rules, so you're more likely to want to find a provider either in Dublin or in Luxembourg, the two typical jurisdictions. So again, it's this idea that all things are equal, and I've got a little bit of understanding, be careful of a little bit of knowledge. You really need to speak to somebody who understands what's required from a Portuguese compliance perspective. You want to be certain that whatever you set up works from a Portuguese tax perspective, that it's acceptable in Portugal. One of the key things there would be to check that you've paid a Portuguese premium tax when you set up such a vehicle. That would indicate that it's compliant within Portugal, and that the company themselves are able to provide a Portuguese tax certificate at the end of the day. You want simplicity. You want one piece of paper that says, this is the tax consequence of holding this investment asset. You pass that to your accountant rather than, say, having to go through a portfolio and calculating all of the income and the gains element and having to make tax decisions, or having your investment decisions guided by a tax consequence. So all of those things are fairly straightforward, but you do have to make sure you've got the right jurisdictions. And I would suggest that for Portugal, Isle of Man, Jersey, Guernsey are not geared up to do that, whereas the European destinations of Dublin and Luxembourg are. You would also want to consider the policyholder protection regimes that are there, because you can find yourself within the European Union in a far better regime than you might find in some of the UK dependent territories.
Okay, well, thanks for that. We've had a couple of questions in while you've been speaking. So this next one, referring to a comment made about actions to be made before moving. If I draw my 25% tax-free from my pension before I move and hold it in the UK in savings, is that tax-free? And if I draw the 25% after the move, is it taxable in Portugal despite being tax-free in the UK?
Okay, so from a pedantic perspective, the money that we take out, the lump sum that we take from our pension is called a pension commencement lump sum. And in the UK, if you take a pension commencement lump sum up to 25% of the fund, in the UK, that's tax-free. From a Portuguese perspective, this is just a lump sum you're taking from your pension. There's no tax-free element. However, if you have the non-habitual residence regime, then you'll pay a flat 10% even on that pension commencement lump sum. So again, that takes us back to one of the questions you asked me right at the beginning, Nigel, which is about the steps in the planning. So it may be if you need that money out of your pension, that you take the pension commencement lump sum before you leave the UK. However, it's not as simple as saying everybody should do that, because if you take that money out of your pension fund, the question now is you're taking it out of a very tax efficient vehicle. There's no tax on the rolled up income and gains. And you're taking that money and you're putting it into your own estate for inheritance tax purposes. It was inheritance tax free where it was, and you've now brought it into a taxed environment. So it's something that you might say, well, yes, on the face of it, that looks like a good idea, but you've got to think of all the knock-on effects for that. So it's a very individual thing. Sit down and have a chat with your financial advisor. What will your income requirements be? What will your capital requirements be in the short term? And how do you plan for that using your pension assets?
Okay. The next one, they have a SIP in partial drawdown, some cash still tax-free. Should they move it to Portugal?
There's no straightforward answer to that. Again, they need to take some advice on it and say, well, like the last question, do I draw down the rest of my pension commencement lump sum? Do I need the capital? And if you don't need the capital, then probably the answer would be leave it where it is and continue to draw down, because with flexible drawdown, you can draw down whatever you need. In the UK, it's more of an issue because you're thinking only the first 25% is tax-free. Thereafter, I'm paying tax on anything else that I draw. In Portugal, you're paying a flat 10% on everything. So you're able to say, actually, I can leave it in the pension fund and it will still most likely be more tax efficient when I come to draw it down in future years as a Portuguese tax resident than I would be had I been paying full rates of income tax in the UK. But that just needs to do that. You need to do the arithmetic, Nigel, for each individual and say, let me understand the tax consequence, but most importantly, what are my requirements? Do I need capital? If I don't, leave it in the tax vehicle. You might consider moving the SIP overseas to get the currency benefits, to lock in the flexibility that you have. One of the issues of leaving pension in the UK is political risk. So we've talked about currency risk, but what about political risk? If in the future, whichever government or colour of government happens to be in power, they do it continually. Every few years we have new rules around pension. So do you want to take your pension out of the UK and lock in the benefits that you currently have? So that would be another consideration, as well as what do I need in terms of income and capital from this asset.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Very clear. In a very complex area. So thank you very much, Gavin, and we'll now move on to some property issues. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nigel.
Thanks, Nigel, for the invitation to speak. And my section is really to give you a bit of an overview of Portugal as the market and drop down into the real estate component or the accommodation component of the process of moving to, retiring to, or purchasing something or renting something in Portugal. Hopefully that will tie together some of the elements that people before me have spoken about. So the accommodation element as a whole is an important component of the puzzle, as it were, because without it, as you've seen from the various speakers, it is very difficult to move other processes forward. You need to prove that you have effectively an address, a residence in Portugal, in order to accomplish many of the other tasks. And so a lot of this hinges around finding the right sort of accommodation. So I'm going to talk through 3 slides, not on the pictures, but I'm just going to put up 3 slides with pictures and then talk about the context of Portugal, and in particular, what has changed and what has not changed in the last sort of 5 or 6 years. And of course, we are talking during a period where COVID has essentially changed a lot of things in the market. So what has changed in the last few years is the economy prior to COVID, one should say, had experienced very strong levels of growth. And the immediate benefit of that to the country as a whole is that there had been a reduction, effectively, in the in government debt as a percentage of GDP. Clearly, that has now reversed with COVID and the measures that the government has had to take to combat some of the issues. But in effect, that increase in expenditure from the government is something that is happening in all countries across Europe and, in fact, the world. So Portugal is not exempt from that spike in investment and in expenditure, as most countries are not. There's been a recent report by the Canadian government highlighting that Portugal seems to be very much better placed, not only relative to previous crises, but also in terms of the current European context to weather the storm. We shall see whether that is the case or not. In terms of the level of activity in the market, what has happened is that from 2014 to 2018-19, approximately, real estate prices, and this includes rental prices, have increased dramatically. In 2019, we started to see a little bit of tailing off of that, mainly because there had been such dramatic price increases in the years before then. Sales volume was down in the first quarter of 2020, but prices, average prices per sale was actually up. So the price per square meter and the average price paid per property in Portugal in the first quarter of the year, which included a month, shall we say, of COVID, was actually higher than previously. And so I think that should answer the question of anyone who says, are we starting to see deep discounting and whatever? Generally speaking, no. I will talk a little bit about rental values, but generally speaking, Portugal is not reacting in the same way as it did in the 2008-2009 crisis, with deep discounting, and a bit of a crisis in the real estate sector. In certain markets, such as Lisbon, the prices increased in that same period to which I referred by as much as 60 to 100%. And in 2018, I know it's slightly outdated now, but to give you a set of context, Portugal was the fourth highest price increase registered, that fourth highest increase in Western Europe at around 10% versus around 4.2% average. So again, the point I wish to make is that as a real estate market, it is not necessarily the cheapest market anymore. There are still opportunities to be found, but I think the old image of Portugal as a very cheap market is something which we need to I think expunge from our thinking process. Around 200,000 or so houses are sold every year. On the screen in front of you, you'll see some of the landscapes or cityscapes, pictures of Porto, Lisbon, Lagos, Cascais, Portimão, that gives you a sense of the sort of urban context of the Portuguese cities, for those who don't know the country that well. Clearly, it's a country with a lot of appeal in terms of the beach, the Gulf, and the marina lifestyle, as it were. And it's a multi-award-winning destination, very popular with many different nationalities. We in our business work with around 25, 26 different nationalities of clients. And so I think it proves more than anything else that Portugal does truly have a global appeal, and that appeal has increased tremendously in the last 4 or 5 years. The availability of real estate varies by region. There is a continued lack of supply of new build or modern apartments. And even in emerging areas, as I would call them, such as the Silver Coast or smaller villages in the Algarve, there's already a reflection of the new build premium. So you might find a traditional property that is priced at, let's say, X, 100,000, and a new build property that might be priced at 2 or 3X, 200 to 300,000. And although that's an extreme, perhaps, example, there is a new build premium which has worked its way into the market. There is regulation which has now been implemented by the Portuguese government, in particular with regards to curbing over tourism, and this is in specifically affects the historical regions of the main cities. Lisbon and Porto in particular have certain historical areas limited in terms of the rental possibilities, in particular short-term rental possibilities, due to the wish by the Portuguese government to curb an over tourism in those markets, and a sort of decharacterization of exactly the characteristics that attracted people to the region in the first place. So rather than having local people live in places, we now have sort of 90% Airbnbs in some locations, and so the government is attempting to balance that supply and demand element to ensure that the traditional element and the appeal of the country remains. Tourism will suffer and is suffering a huge impact due to coronavirus, just in our business, because we work with rentals and we work with sales and a whole range of other areas. I spent most of my March and bits of April processing client refunds due to events we were running or whatever that were postponed. And I've spent most of June and July, again, refunding people who are cancelling trips. You know, a lot of British people who were worried about the quarantine, Irish people who don't have Portugal on the green corridor. So it's been a very turbulent time for the tourist industry in the country, and that has led to some discounting of rental amounts. In terms of the source of demand, that has changed. So the British market, as you probably all know, represented a substantial portion of the inbound tourism from or to Portugal, and that has changed in the last few years, primarily because of the non-habitual residency program. It has brought in many French, Swedes, and other Northern Europeans attracted by the low tax environment, of course, in addition to all the other characteristics, intrinsic characteristics of the country. But it's meant that areas such as the Algarve or Greater Lisbon, like Cascais, are much more cosmopolitan in feel, rather than having a very British sort of expat feel. It's now quite common to see foreign number plates as people try to get their cars registered, or people speaking different languages. So that's been a change in the last few years, and fortunately so, because Brexit introduced an element of risk and uncertainty into the country, and that slack has been picked up by other nationalities, sort of non-British nationalities. And then the exchange rate, clearly the pound has taken a hit historically, but for other nationalities, the dollar, for example, is not far off what it was maybe 5 years ago. So we're not, you know, the euro and dollars have traded blows over the last few years. So those coming from North America, perhaps less of a currency issue, versus taking a decision 5 years ago, where from a pound perspective, you know, that's not been the case. What has not changed in the country, and I'm putting now up a slide about sort of explaining different architectural styles, but to let people know that various different things are available: the rustic, the traditional, the contemporary, the more modern, the refurbished. But what has not changed in the country is the fundamentals, or are the fundamentals. So it's still the third safest country in the world. It's the second best country in the world at integrating migrants, and we are all migrants when we migrate to a new country, so it's not intended in the pejorative sense at all. Ease of travel and connectivity is fantastic, even though it lies on the western edge of Europe. It has the 12th best healthcare system in the world, and I think we've heard already a comment about the fact that it mirrors very, very closely the UK national health system. And I unfortunately am a beneficiary of both, because I am recovering from COVID, having suffered some complications from the disease. So I did have to, for the first time in a long time, make the most of the NHS, and I would say that I didn't rank it any higher than I have my sort of family's experiences with the SNS, Sistema Nacional de Saúde in Portugal. If there are any Americans or Canadians on the call, the healthcare can be up to 90% cheaper than in the US. It's the 12th best country in which to bring up a family in the world. You know, it's no longer the world's best kept secret, because the Algarve in particular has been voted the best place in the world to retire, I think, for the last 8 years in a row. It does have the lowest cost of living in Western Europe, with the exception of some items. Housing has now become one of those. And fuel or gas, if you're in the US, electricity, electrical items, telecommunication, those tend to be a bit pricier than the norm. Pretty much everything else tends to be cheaper. And of course, we've had people talk about the attractiveness from a fiscal and tax perspective of the country. If I may move on to basically giving you a little bit of a comparative study. It's not a study as much as a walk through the country from north to south. So the north of the country is cheaper generally in terms of its cost of living. It's very steeped in history and culture. It is colder and rainier. People think that Portugal is all sunshine. It's not. The reason why the north is green is because it rains more. It's as simple as that. And so it's a very beautiful green area, but the weather is perhaps not as appealing as when one comes further south. There is increasing rental regulation around Porto, and a typical, and I'm using the same example throughout the country, excluding the islands. I'm not. It's not that I'm in any way discriminating. I just didn't have space on the slide. A two-bedroom property in the north, perhaps in Porto, 250,000, rentals from around 800 euros a month. The Silver Coast, it's traditionally, historically cheaper, again steeped in history. There has been a trend to build new or modern product. It is windy. It is one of the disadvantages of that coast. It is directly exposed to the Atlantic, and so the entire Portuguese coast has wind, but that is particularly windy when compared to the others. Traditional properties can start as low as around 75,000, with 750 euros being a reasonable amount of money to pay for a rent. A modern property equivalent two-bedroom, probably 220,000 across the main sort of cities on the Silver Coast is what you'll have to pay. Cascais and Estoril, which is the sort of the Côte d'Azur, if you will, of Portugal, the area where the kings and royalty in the past used to travel in Portugal. This is a very cosmopolitan area. An existing expat community exists there. Expensive sales and rentals, especially as a result of the price increases of the last few years. 350,000 plus for a two-bedroom, 1,350 euros per month. Again, with the usual caveat, and I make Gavin's words my own. You know, I hold my hands up and say that there are probably many exceptions to this rule. You might find something a little bit cheaper, a lot of stuff a lot more expensive, but this is a guideline price to give you a sense of the comparison between areas. The Linha, as we call it, which is between Cascais and Lisbon, and has easy access to both. It's an urban type environment, less character in some instances. Prices are rising fast, but you can still get some more value for money. So if you like to be near Lisbon or Cascais or both, but don't want to pay their premiums, then 225,000 probably will get you into that market there, and 900 euros per month going upwards. Lisbon itself, some very good yields, although those are dropping due to property prices. It's very good for purchasing historical property, you know, that charming facade, you know, in a historical traditional area, good for that. Quick movers. So please don't ask us or anyone else to send you a list today of what's available, and then if your decision is in 6 months' time, it'll be completely and utterly different a market. We had a Chinese client calling us yesterday. He'd been in touch 3 months ago, and we did fall into the trap of, you know, sending him a list, and every single thing on that list had been sold. So we were quite strict about, you know, setting timeframes within which we sort of communicate property information, because we need to understand the markets. There is, I've always said this, the risk of overheating in Lisbon due to the dramatic price increases in the city, although that's tempered now a little bit by the COVID influence. There is a strict rental regulation, as we talked about, 300,000 euros plus to get into the market. I would say realistically, probably a bit more than that, 1,500 per month for a two-bed. Refurbishment, 225,000 for something that needs some fairly substantial refurbishment. And then the Algarve, which is the top tourist destination. It has the highest number of real estate inquiries, and I think the statistics that Nigel showed reinforce that it's still the #1 destination in terms of inquiries. It has more sunny days than California. It has a large multinational expat community, as I've said, multilingual as well. So English is not a difficult, it's not difficult to find people who speak English, locals or others. It's also a very good market for what I call a combination type existence. If you're buying and you want to rent out in the summer and use the property in the winter, or if you want to optimize the yields by renting by the week in the summer and by the month in the winter, this is a market that allows you to do that more so than excuse me, than a few of the other markets around the country. 175,000 realistically will get you into the market with a 2-bed, 900 euros per month. Rent starts at 75,000 and upwards. And the alert at the bottom, I think, is important. Please don't expect premium locations, you know, at a sort of countryside price, because those days, I think, are long gone. A little bit about the Algarve, because it is the one that that the majority of people ask about, or a big percentage of people ask about. Voted best place in the world to retire for 8 years in a row. Some of the best beaches, golf courses, marinas, so blue flags, award-winning, and so on. English is not an issue. It's as often a question that it arises about whether people will be able to integrate. Yes, you will if English is one of your languages. We've had people from other non-English speaking countries able to integrate very well, and that's because there are also associations of different foreign communities, if that's something that you wish to participate in, and they would meet periodically, and that would allow you to speak to someone in Swedish and French and so on, as well as Portuguese or English. The food and wine among the best and the freshest in the world. We are the largest fish consumer in Europe, and I think the second largest in the world after the Japanese. The real estate, although it's increased in price, it's still very attractive. And the Algarve generally is less developed than Spain, although I should caveat that because Spain is such a massive market that if you're in the northern Costa Blanca, you know, between Gouveia and Moreira, for example, you know, you may well have a low density area, and if you're in Portimão and the Algarve, it's a high density area. So again, it's a generalization, but in the main, areas that people understand and you know are accustomed to dealing with tend to be less developed in Portugal than in Spain. Many activities. It's also been historically quite a private place. The Portuguese are quite reserved as a nation, and there's a quite high respect for privacy. So in particular in COVID times, or semi-post Corona virus first wave times, this is something that a lot of people are seeking. So moving on, in terms of the decisions that many people are having to make, some of those involve whether or not they wish to rent versus buy. And we've done a little table here as to, you know, what you should be, depending on the situation you're in, the sorts of things that you might be considering. So if you're not sure whether this is your destination and you want to trial something, then clearly you should have an element of rental in your solution. If you love this, you've been going to the country for 10 years, 12 years or whatever, and it's been your dream to settle, then clearly you're more a candidate to purchase a property for all sorts of different reasons. If you're thinking of investing and building a revenue generating portfolio, which is still possible, you need to look around, but it's possible, then really you should be buying. If it's a part of your residence, clearly you should be renting. But if you're looking to split your time, and we have clients, for example, that split some time between Colombia, Portugal, the US, they've bought a property, they rent it out when they're not there, and they occupy it themselves when they are. And these are both residents and non-residents. So you know, the purchase is a good solution when you've got a hybrid situation or scenario where you want to use the property yourself, but actually want to use the revenue to actually cover your cost, and sometimes to even fund those periods of your own stay, especially if you're intending to stay in the winter and then rent out in the summer. If you sort of love a property but you need some time to sell back home, so you'd like to buy something, clearly we have people who are building houses and need to rent first, or who think they need time to look around and so rent first before buying. And I can certainly answer some questions about ideal rental times if you're certain you are going to buy, but that's a different question. Flexibility and reduced capital investment, so they have a limited pension and want to have a fallback plan in terms of holding on to the capital. Clearly, then a rental solution would be better because you're preserving the capital. We have someone else who's moving, UK residents moving from Dubai. They don't have any heirs, and they've said, well, we don't mind using up our capital because we're not leaving this to anyone. So those sort of personal situations may also affect the sort of solution that you adopt. Clearly, the residency and any tax statuses that you might wish to apply for will affect your ability to do so. And here I should make the point that the NHR status does not require a purchase. You can apply for the NHR status by proving your residency either via a suitable rental contract, or by showing and proving that you have paid the tax and have the deeds, and sometimes don't even have the deeds, but you paid your tax on the purchase of a property. So rental or purchase will qualify you as long as it's the correctly drafted documents. They will qualify you for the NHR status as long as you meet, of course, all the other criteria of the status itself. If you're worried about needing care in the future, and if you think you may need to move homes, so for example, you think your idyllic situation is, countryside villa over 2 floors plus a basement area, miles away from anyone because you're protected from COVID, but actually you're 76 years old, and at 78 you might need care, and perhaps that countryside villa might not look as attractive as it at 78 as it did at 76, for example. And clearly, if you want an age-specific solution, there are options which are both rental and purchasing based. And then I think you can go back and see the video. A couple of the websites we run will give you a lot more information on that. So just a snapshot of one of the websites we run called algarvelonglets.com. And I've kind of divided a rather busy screen. On the left, you can see the sort of results you get if you put in, I don't know what the search was. So sort of in the Lagos area, an apartment, and you want something that's available for monthly winter lets, you can then see the price range there. I think I put in 2 bedrooms, I did, and that was between sort of 990 a month, and then there's some that go up to 1,450 a month. So it depends on what you look for. And then another search, which was villa on an annual let, and then we came up with the results showed a series of properties, the lowest of which on this screen, and maybe lower, I didn't sort it by price, was 1,350 per month. And the highest was around 2,300 on this particular screen. So you can see there is a price range depending on the type of and style of property that is on offer. I want to touch briefly on the golden visa as a post-Brexit solution. So some people, I can't remember the statistics exactly that Nigel pointed out to us beforehand, but I think it was around 40-something% were thinking of making a move, whether rental or purchase, in this year, 2020, which means that there's 56% who are not. At some point in the future, they will. And then the golden visa itself may be a solution for people. So on the assumption that the UK will become a third nation external to the EU, and residency rights will have to be applied for on the same basis as anyone else outside the EU, then the golden visa is one of these options, and that's a purchase option as opposed to a non-purchase option such as the D7 retirement visa, which I'm not sure if it was spoken about or not, but there are 4 golden visa categories in Portugal. They range from 280,000 to 500,000 or above, but these are the limits of compulsory investment that one has to make to qualify, and they essentially depend on location. The interesting thing about this, just briefly, is most golden visa buyers, and remember that a large majority are Chinese, followed by Brazilians, South Africans, Russians, Turkish, and a few others, But the golden visa buyers typically want to be in big cities. But they also then look for a few other criteria. So I think in the future, British people who go down the golden visa route will actually change the profile of the golden visa applicant, because British people are not necessarily interested in always being in the big cities. They may, for example, be quite happy to consider a lower cost inland golden visa, such as 280,000, or do a sort of coastal low density municipality golden visa, which would be 400,000. So I think British people going forward, we will see if Brits use the golden visa as a solution, we will see those other categories coming into their own. And just as an example, for not only for British people going forward, but anyone else who may be on this call and who is not an EU citizen at the moment, this is an example of a low density coastal golden visa property. And you can see that for the same value of the 3-bedroom sort of golf course villa, you would get maybe an apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment in Lisbon, and which wouldn't qualify for a golden visa because it would probably need to be at the 500,000 level, whereas this does because of the low density. So I think the analysis of the golden visa going forward, and even for those non-EU citizens currently considering it, is very important. Okay. The other thing that's important is drilling down into your criteria, because it's no use saying, oh, I'd like a 2-bedroom apartment with a pleasant view. You know, this could result in multiple outcomes depending on your other criteria. And I've attempted to show this on this slide. So if you added any of these, so for example, a condo with on-site amenities, that will give you a certain option. If you say, well, I want it to be under 200,000, the option will be totally different, because the condo with the amenities would be above 200,000, and so on and so forth. And I think the point I want to make with this is that it's a point that I think was made by someone, I can't remember exactly who it was. I think Edwina made the point that increasingly we are seeing agencies work on the basis of representing buyers. And we as a business have been doing this for at least the last 6 or 7 years. When all the other agencies thought, oh, why are you representing the buyer? You always get paid by the seller, was the obvious answer. We thought, well, because we don't know what the buyer initially wants. We've got to be prepared to listen in order to adapt the search or the conversations we have with other real estate partners and companies to the requirements of the, and I say buyer, it could be tenant or renter. So the client will dictate the process. And the difficulty is sometimes in the traditional model of speaking to 20 real estate agencies and so on, is that it's very difficult to wade through this morass of communication, website information, and so on and so forth. So just as you should be attempting to concentrate fiscal advice, legal advice, we highly recommend, not just because we do this, but we also work in other ways, but if you can, try to concentrate your search with a preferred partner that you sense understands you and can help you work through the whole selection process, whether it be rental or sales. And importantly, what you will find is if you are a rent before buy candidate, try to work with someone who can work with you through the entire process. Because if you think, oh, I'm going to find a house to buy myself, the first, you talk to agencies and then they will say, well, when are you ready to buy? Oh, in a year's time. Well, they'll switch off because there's no immediate business. So you're then going to find someone else and say, well, can I rent from you? Well, I don't really have many rentals and so on. And when you do, you say, well, can you help me to buy something? Well, I don't really work with the buying process. So try to simplify your interfaces in any new country by working with an organization that maybe does both. And the reason we say this is to avoid the sort of process that often goes on, especially if you are limited in terms of time. And the 31st of December, again, for those UK residents, citizens rather, is fast approaching. Travel is not so easy. And so if you start off with a Google 2-bedroom apartments with sea view in town X, you'll come up with a list of properties and agents. You start to plan the visit, which, by the way, many people won't be able to do because they can't fly back. There's a quarantine, blah, blah, blah. So you get confused. You ask the same agents twice. The busy agents will quit. They won't even bother because people are quite busy anyway. Just before the visit, you'll find that some properties are not available. Then you go with the second agent. They might show you the same property. You then want to rent out. The agent doesn't do rental management, and you get a sense of the sort of process that might occur. So we had the same thing on the Spain call when I was listening in. Many of the agencies in Spain were proposing the same thing as we are in Portugal, which is really try to concentrate, if you can at all, the search of your process with a preferred partner, reliable, somebody you can trust, a company you can trust, so that you have that continuity and that simplicity. The other thing we often get asked about, and this applies also to Nigel's event. So Expat World was going to run a physical event, but of course it's impossible to predict what the quarantine and the travel arrangements will be like, and therefore that event is in abeyance, it's sort of on hold. But it does not mean that we cannot continue to attend clients on the ground. So we continue to have our very popular discovery tours, which is a sort of combination of tourism and real estate. And these are excellent for those people who know a region more or less, but not quite sure exactly where. They want to compare the options in different towns, see different options while they are there in a very sharp, concentrated fashion. They tend to be sort of 1 to 2 days, depending on the extent of the criteria and the options available. And importantly, in COVID times, what we have done is we now use purposely, we rent larger vehicles so that we can still maintain social distancing while not losing the benefit of having one of our expert team members in the same car as the client. So in the past, clients traveled with our team, and they were obviously exchanging ideas, questions, and answers. But in the future, that will continue. Not in the future, we're doing it already. That continues, but in much larger vehicles. So people now sit to the back with a minimum two sort of meter distance, with masks on, and so on. So it's sort of COVID-proofed, as it were, as much as possible. And then finally, I'm sorry, I normally watch my time on my phone, so I hope I haven't gone over too much. There's an email contact for our firm. If you want to find out a little bit about different points, so retirement living generally, then the best site for referral is the Algarve Senior Living site. If the property finder or buyer agent model is something that struck your interest, then there is a site specifically on that, propertyfinderportugal.com. If you want annual and winter lets, an example will be algarvelonglets.com, and then a couple of our social media. And sorry, my messages keep coming up here. So those are the contacts for clients located in each region. You can call a sort of local number, and that will get through to us. And that is that. Thanks very much, Nigel, and thank you all for listening.
Well, many thanks, Lewis. We should at this stage have seen all about the property market and how you find a property and the most attractive areas and so on. But let's move on to the point where we've actually selected the property and sort of talk about what is the next step that people should be taking.
Well, both processes are interlinked anyway. I would most definitely suggest that anyone who's thinking of investing in Portugal try and contact and find a lawyer that's compatible with them, even whilst they are still searching for a property, because there can be benefits to having a lawyer in place already. Obviously, there's many questions that can be discussed prior to actually making an offer on the property. It also means that you already have a lawyer in place once you do find a property, which can obviously assist in terms of timeline, especially when you've located a property that is in a popular area at a very attractive price and there could be other buyers. This said, once you do find a property, you know, and you have engaged a lawyer, the next step really is to put the agent and the lawyer in touch so that there can be a sharing of property documents and information on the property so that the lawyer can start progressing with the conveyancing process. I think it's also important at this stage, once you have found the property, to decide whether this is going to be your primary residence or whether you're going to use this property as a holiday home initially, because this will have an impact on purchase taxes.
Okay, so people are often suggested that they use the developer's lawyer or the lawyer recommended by an estate agent. So is it really necessary and important to use an independent lawyer, and what are the advantages?
I mean, absolutely. It's important to have an independent lawyer because you want something who's looking out for your interests and is going to be impartial in all situations. This said, there are many agents that recommend lawyers, not because the lawyers work for the agents per se, but because they've worked in the past for other clients, and the agents have found the lawyers to be proactive, to know what they're doing. Obviously, you do want someone that's going to be looking out for your interests. So it is important to find a lawyer yourself, and also to ensure that that lawyer is compatible with you and that you feel comfortable and have trust in that lawyer. And
we here talk about power of attorney. Do you normally suggest that people issue a power of attorney, and what are the advantages?
This is actually one of the first questions that I tend to ask clients. It's whether they're going to be able to travel or be in Portugal to sign a potential promissory contract or even a final deed. Because if they are not able to travel or not going to be here for whatever reason, or feel that they may not be able to be here, then a power of attorney is definitely the way forward. This is a document that enables the buyer to give the lawyer powers to represent that buyer during the process of a purchase. Okay, it's a legal document that is signed either before a notary or before another lawyer for it to become valid. These documents here in Portugal do not have validity dates, and one of the questions that I do get asked quite commonly is, can I as a lawyer with a power of attorney act without the client's consent? The answer is yes, but I would obviously never do that because I would not want to risk my practicing license. And secondly, I would not go and buy a property for a client without the client giving me the authority and the money to do so, of course. Power of attorney is very helpful, especially, you know, in certain situations such as representing you at the tax office to obtain a fiscal number, which is necessary for a purchase in Portugal, to represent you at the end of the process by changing the contracts for the utilities, so for the electricity, the gas, the water. There are a number of things in which the power of attorney is helpful, even if you did choose to come and sign a final deed or promissory contract yourself.
Okay, thanks, Serena. So what does the conveyancing process involve in Portugal, and how does it differ from the sort of process people might be more used to in the UK?
Okay, so in Portugal, the conveyancing process will involve initially receiving the property documents for the property to do all of the necessary checks. These checks will involve checking whether there are any charges on the properties, whether there are any debts, illegalities, whether the documents harmonise in terms of area, in terms of who the owners are. Most of the documents here in Portugal are actually electronic, and they have a validity date of circa 6 months. So I would always want to see updated documents for the property. Upon analysing the documents and establishing that everything is in order to move forward, we would then, in most cases, move towards a promissory contract. this is a contract whereby the purchaser is promising to buy the property and the seller is promising to sell the property. It's a binding contract, and obviously if any of the parties were to back out of this contract, there would be penalties. Okay, moving forward from the promissory contract, in fact, during the negotiations for the promissory contract, there can be some conditions that need to be fulfilled for a final deed to take place. Sometimes you could have a situation where the parties have agreed that the building is in need of painting in a certain section, or that some construction needs to be done beforehand. There are several instances that could appear and that could be conditions in the contract. Moving on from the contract, you would be working towards a final deed. That final deed will take place before a notary, which is a third independent party who would receive all the documents and all of the information from both buyer, seller, methods of payments, property documents, and would actually formalise the act of the purchase and sale. In the UK, I understand that the conveyancing process can be slightly different. I do not personally have experience with the process in the UK, so I wouldn't be able to point out any differences.
Okay. And so what issues do you tend to come across when you carry out the searches in Portugal? Are there particular issues that commonly arise?
Yeah, the most common issues that I've come across are sometimes issues with the areas. Sometimes you have a registered area in the tax office and a different registered area in the land registry. This can be caused due to a number of situations and can in most cases be resolved. Sometimes there are charges registered to the property at the land registry. These could be, for example, because someone has not been making payments for their council tax and therefore the tax office has registered a charge. Again, this can be resolved, it can be removed. You do on occasion find some illegalities in properties. This is why it's really important to have a lawyer check obviously the documents and go through everything with the buyer. You know, I've had situations where sometimes a pool isn't legal, or there's been a change to the facade of the property which actually should be subject to planning and hasn't. So there are a lot of issues that could come up. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will come up in every single purchase and sale, but they could, and it is important to make sure that we're checking all of this before the purchaser goes ahead.
Okay. And what about surveys? Is it normal practice to have a survey carried out in Portugal? Would you recommend that people carry out a survey?
It wasn't normal practice, although I have seen an increase in the request of surveys in recent years. Really, it depends on the type of property that you're purchasing and whether you've caught up on any issues during a visit to the property. You know, it depends really on the individual circumstances. I mean, one thing that we do get, especially in the Algarve, with some properties, is sometimes some issues with damp, which are quite common because of the properties being so close to the coast. There are treatments that can be done to address that issue. One thing that the survey can help is when clients aren't able to come here in person. They may have visited the property, gone back to their home country, and obviously in the meantime documents have been exchanged. I, as a lawyer, would have received plans. It could be helpful to have a survey to make sure that those plans that are registered and deposited with the City Hall actually reflect the physical reality of the property. So if there is the opportunity to have a survey done, then yes, I would recommend to have one. This said, sometimes some purchases can be time sensitive. Surveys can take some time to take place and for the reports to become available. And until such time as a promissory contract is signed, that property is open to be sold to someone else. And this is something that needs to be borne in mind also.
Okay, thank you. So looking at the costs, so other than the purchase price, what should people allow for? Are there agency fees? Who pays? Does the buyer or the seller pay them? What are the other fees that need to be paid? And are there any taxes or stamp duty to pay?
Okay, so in terms of agency fees, these are usually paid by the seller. The seller is the one who will have a contract with the agent in most cases, although it has slowly started to become the case where you can, as a buyer, have a contract with an agent for them to be your sole agent to assist you in locating a property. So there could potentially be fees payable by the buyer as well, depending on your personal situation. In addition to the agency fees, you could also have, you will also have, sorry, purchase taxes, which are the transfer tax and stamp duty. Now, the stamp duty is usually a flat rate of 0.8% of the declared purchase figure. Okay, the transfer tax, however, is on a sliding scale and will really depend on whether you're declaring this property as your primary residence or as a holiday home. There could also be variables when you have, for example, a mixed property. In Portugal, sometimes you can purchase a property that has an urban element, which would be the section of the property that would have the house itself, and you could have a rustic element, which would be taxed at a different rate to the urban element. You could also have a situation, for example, in which you're buying an apartment and a garage, but the garage is deemed to be an independent property to the apartment itself, and therefore those again would be taxed at different rates. All in all, I would expect purchasers to take into account roughly 8% of the purchase value. For more individual estimate of costs, you know, I would urge them to get in touch with their lawyer to get a breakdown according to the property that they've chosen.
Okay, we've had a query from one of the audience about a deposit they've been asked for before the seller will take the property off the market. Is this normal practice? What's its status? And is there anything they need to be aware of?
Okay, so some agents have this policy whereby they will take what is known commonly as a reservation fee for a property. So imagine a buyer's gone to see a property, they are really interested in this property. The agent will suggest to the buyer to pay a reservation fee and sign a reservation agreement so that that property is removed from the market until such time as a promissory contract can be signed. Legally, this is possible. There are legal provisions to allow an agent to receive this reservation fee and hold it in a client account for that purpose. In terms of the reservation agreement itself, I would always recommend that clients get in touch with the lawyer to make sure that obviously the conditions within the reservation agreement are favourable and that they understand everything that's contained within. I've come across, for example, some situations where this reservation fee is non-refundable, and for example, the client has paid a reservation fee, the property documents have only been made available after the payment of the reservation fee. It turns out that the property had issues, and actually the reservation agreement says that that reservation is non-refundable, which, you know, makes it quite difficult because you then either purchase within the same agent a different property to not lose those funds, or you run the risk of losing them. So really, I would make sure that that agreement is checked before signed. But it is something that has become quite common. The only other thing that I would like to mention in regards to these reservation fees are that they do not bind the seller to sell the property to you as a buyer. The seller will take the property off the market, but he is still able legally to accept other offers if he wants to.
Okay. So another query here was somebody has been asked to underdeclare the purchase price. Is that sort of common practice, and what would be your advice?
Okay, I would not advise to underdeclare the purchase price, although there is a common practice to attribute some of the value towards contents if a property is being sold with contents. Okay, you may make a small saving by underdeclaring the purchase price in terms of transfer tax and stamp duty, but actually you need to be thinking about what happens when you sell the property. Now, if this is your secondary habitation or a holiday home, you will be paying capital gains on any profit you make on the property, and the rate at which you're charged on that profit is going to be far higher than the saving that you would make by underdeclaring slightly the purchase value. With a primary habitation, depending on what your intentions would be for the future in terms of reinvestment, you could or not pay capital gains. But again, the rate would be much higher than the saving that you would make by underdeclaring. Again, if the property is being bought with contents, then yes, by all means, you know, the parties can agree to attribute a small portion of that purchase price towards those contents. But if not, I would declare the full purchase price.
Okay, thanks. So as it's approached to the completion, and what preparation is undertaken for that, and how does the notary sort of fit into the completion process?
Okay, well, obviously we would go through the initial stage, which would lead us again to this promissory contract, which is the contract that binds the parties to sell and purchase the property. At that stage, there would have been potentially some negotiations and some conditions to be fulfilled until final deed. So we would want to ensure that between promissory contract and a final deed that those conditions have been fulfilled. We would want to make the booking with the notary. We would want to send all of that documentation through to the notary, you know, to be able to appear at the appointment on the day that's being set. You would want to ensure, if you hadn't done so before, that you have your Portuguese fiscal number by this stage, that you have transferred the funds to Portugal for the remainder of the purchase price, to ensure that you're either able to travel to Portugal or that you have given your lawyer power of attorney, whether on your initial visit to Portugal, whether that power of attorney is dealt with in your country of origin, which is also possible. And essentially everything gets sent to the notary, and you would then appear at the notary, or your lawyer would appear on your behalf to formalize the act of the purchase and sale.
Okay, and so on the day of completion, what's the process there? What happens on the final day?
Okay, so on the day of completion, everyone would attend at the notary. The notary would have prepared the deed ahead of that appointment. The deed would be read out in Portuguese, okay, before everyone who is present. If the purchasers were to be there in person and did not understand the Portuguese language, I, as their lawyer or any other person who is representing them, could do a translation into the English language. However, the document would be signed in Portuguese because we are in Portugal and the document needs to be formalized in the Portuguese language. Once the document is signed, you are, for all purposes, the legal owner of the property. The final deed itself, the original document, gets archived with the notary, and you would receive, as the buyer, a certified copy. This means that if you were to lose the document, the certified copy, or if it were to get destroyed, or if anything were to happen, you could always obtain a new copy of this document. And then following the final deed, there would be a request for a registration at the land registry for that property to be transferred into the buyer's names.
Okay. And is there anything else you would sort of recommend around completion, or is that it covered?
One thing that I usually ask questions following completion is, you know, if they're not here, who would they want me to hand the keys over? Do they have someone that manages the property for them? Would they want me to hold the keys in the meantime? The other thing that comes up quite often is the changeover of the utility contracts. I get questioned quite a lot on this topic because obviously, how do we establish who's meant to pay what in terms of the bills? What happens on the day of the final deed is that usually the agent would take meter readings for the utilities, for the electricity, the water, the gas, and would provide those to the lawyer, so that when the lawyer gets those contracts changed over, she can provide that reading to the companies, so that the seller is charged up until that reading and the buyer is charged from that reading onwards. Other things that some buyers may want to consider post completion is whether they are, again, if this is going to be a holiday home, whether they want to use that holiday home for short lets. Also in regards to whether it would be feasible for them, whether they want to start making plans to have a Portuguese will to cover their Portuguese assets. These are all things that can be discussed post, obviously, final deed.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Edwina. Very clear and helpful. That's this is Celia Vance of Algarve Assistance, and if you'd like to share your screen, I think we can see that now, and I'll leave it with you. Thank you.
Hello, good morning to everyone. So thank you for the invitation to be here today. I will speaking regarding mortgage, rentals, car matriculation, and driving license. First, this is the service that my company offers: mortgage and loans, rentals, vehicle matriculation with tax or tax exemption, exchange or registered driving license, fiscal representation, and non-habitual residence tax, especially then submit the tax returns. So, mortgage and loans, there are quite different ones. We have for residential, we have for second house or investment, or non-resident, plot plus construction, mortgage transference, and equity release. In Portugal, is really quite common way to finance the purchase of a property in Portugal. Both residents or non-residents can apply for a mortgage from the Portuguese banks. The key benefit of taking out the Portuguese mortgage is that the lender will carry out the legal checks on the property and arrange for a valuation to take place. However, I always advise the clients to use a lawyer in all the process of buying a property. Another benefit that if you should decide to let your property in a short or a long-term contract, your rental income in euros may offset or cover the mortgage payments in euros from the Portuguese bank, which naturally hedge any currency risk. Should you decide to use non-euro mortgage facilities abroad, you'd be exposed to the foreign currency risk. Now, we have some different criteria if it is for a residential homes or for a second homes or non-resident people. So the banks consider it, some banks consider it that you are resident for this kind of residential homes if you are living here more than the 5 years to have access of a loan for residential loans. The loans for residential can go up to 50 years. The maximum of age is between 70 to 80 years old, depending on the lender, and the max of the borrow is between 60 to 19% of the less value, the acquisition price or the valuation price. For the second homes or investments, the loan can go up to 30 years. The maximum age is between 70 to 80 years old, and the max borrow 60 and 70% of the value of the acquisition price or the evaluation price. We have as well a loan for the plot and the construction. This is an option as well. Usually, it's possible to get between 50 to 60% if you are non-resident, and can go up to 19% if you are a resident. The borrow, it's a combining costs of the land and the construction. However, this kind of mortgages are quite complex because it has a lot of evaluations. So if anyone needs this kind of advice, then I will help specifically, because this is not very easy, this kind of mortgage. Another thing that we need to see, to have considered, is the interest rate. We have two kinds of interest rates: the variable rate and the fixed rate, and even now we have the mixed rate. So the variable rate is always lower than the fixed rate. The variable rate is the spread plus the variable that can be 3, 6, or 12 months. In case the client decides to pay early redemption, will pay a penalty of 0.5%. In case it is a fixed rate, the early redemption penalty is 2%, and this kind of the loans just can go up to 30 years old, to 30 years. So the big difference is for the client, the fixed rate, it doesn't have any fluctuation regarding the variable. The variable rate, we don't know what will happen with the variable if one day will go up. To have the idea, the annual percentage rate for a fixed rate can be around 4.5%, and for the variable rate, 3.3%. The process to get a mortgage in Portugal is easy for the client. It's not a very complex process. My company has a license to the Bank of Portugal, so we work with several banks here in Portugal. The client can send us all the documents that is needed, and the documents, it's quite normal documents. It's a credit report, 2 years of the tax return, proof of income, 3 months of bank statements. After that, I will study the process and I will choose the best banks for that client. Then I will receive the simulations from the bank, and I will appoint a meeting with the client to explain the bank simulations. If the client agrees with the simulation, the second stage is apply for the evaluation of the property. This is made by an independent expert. With the value of the evaluation, we know the maximum value that the bank will loan. Remember that the bank just will borrow a percentage of the less value, or the valuation, or the price acquisition. So the third stage is the bank will issue the final credit letter. and this must be signed by the client. The client has 8 days for reflection, and after these 8 days, we can appoint the deed. So it's really a simple process. During this, maybe starting the process to the end, we'll have 1 month and a half, 2 months, if we have all the documents. But there are some costs that the client should consider, such as the transfer tax, the stamp duty, the notary fees, the valuation fees, and the bank charge fees. So this is need to have much more money for all these costs. Now, I would like to speak on the rentals. Rentals in Portugal, we have the short-term rentals and the long-term rentals. For the long-term rentals, it's required a rental contract. It's pay a stamp duty that is 10% over 1 month of rent, requires energetic certificate, and the tax rate on rental income maximum is 28%. This is a much less bureaucratic rental than the short term. Of course, against the tax, we can deduct some expenses, such as the condominium charge, property tax, insurance, repairs, works. However, in this kind of simple long term, we are not allowed to deduct interest, shares, kitchens, all the things that we can take out from the property, the tax will not accept. And the rentals the long-term rentals for the landlord is really simple. For the long-term rentals for the tenant, it's required a Portuguese tax number. So even if people are here just for 2 months and is doing a long-term rental, must request the Portuguese tax number. Usually in Portugal, must give a deposit, give a notice when leaving, and usually the utility bills are not included in the rent. And the rents can be deducted on the tax income if you didn't. The short term for the landlord. So this is very regulated. And first, it's mandatory to request a rental license. This request is made online to the council where is the property. To open the accommodation, you must first request a rental license, and for that it is needed to open the activity in the tax office. And people must be aware that this is a business in Portugal, so it's not so simple as the long term. It must have insurance, it must have complaint books, so it has a lot of things to be aware. Another thing that is important to be aware when you have a short term is after the client make the check-in, you must report this to the SEF. Okay, usually people don't know that. For the tax point of view, the short terms has a lot of options to be considered. So even you can have capital gains even if you are not selling your property just because you open a short term. So always ask an advisor to help you if you should do a short term rent, if you should open or not, because this can have a lot of consequences as in fiscal terms. Car matriculation. So we have car matriculation with tax exemption or without tax exemption. If you just want to bring your car to Portugal, but you are not moving your residency to Portugal, you can bring it, but you have to pay the tax. The tax in Portugal for cars are very higher. So before you come, it's better you ask to do a simulation. If the car has a big engine or a very higher CO2, probably you will pay a lot of tax. Without paying the tax, the process is simple because you just need the car registration, the certificate of conformity, the ID card or passport, fiscal number, and the car go to the inspection, and that's it, and pay the tax. Now, when you are moving to Portugal, you can bring, each person can bring a car as tax exempt. A car or a moto can bring one for 4 persons. So in order to register a foreign car in Portugal, you will need some documents. There are ones more difficult than the others. The car registration, usually the clients have it, identification card and passport as well, fiscal number as well. Give the permission to the customer to see if your situation are good in Portugal. That is something quite easy. But then we have the cancellation of the resident. So, and this is a document that is issued by the competent authorities of the countries where you are coming. And this must showing the dates on which you took up and when you cancel the residence on that country. So it's really must say when you're starting to live there, or if it is the country that you're born, of course, doesn't say that, but must say the date that you cancel the residence and must say that you are moving to Portugal. Without this document, you are not able to have the car import with tax exemption. Another document that sometimes the client does have is the certificate of conformity. This is always asked in the garage, and sometimes they ask money for this document. And it is needed, and sometimes it's not so easy as well, is the documents that prove the residence on the country that you are coming, because sometimes it's just in the name of the man or in the name of the woman. But without these documents, so the document is to prove the residence in your home country for the last 6 months. It's to prove the residency or the country that you are coming. Can be house renting receipts, electricity bills, water bills, pay slips, tax. Doesn't need to be the 6 months of electricity or water. You can have 1 month of electricity, another month of water. What is needed that 6 months show your address on the country that you live. Another thing that is quite important to consider is the car must have been in your property for the least 6 months. Before you arrive, you had the car at least 6 months. You have 12 months to ask for this registration for tax exemption. You can sell or donate the car for 5 years. If you sell or donate the car until these 5 years, you have to pay the tax. You have to keep your residence in Portugal at least for 1 year, and during this you cannot go out of Portugal more than 1 month. Only you or your spouse or who lives with you in that address can drive the car. So you cannot just loan a car to a friend to drive it. That cannot happen, because if the police stop, you will have a fine. In case of that, of the owner, the spouse who came to Portugal as well can request the exemption of the car tax in 3 months. So if one of these conditions doesn't happen, you have to pay the tax. The process is, after we have all the documents, the process is simple, okay? So just to fill a few documents and sign. First, the car must go to inspection. This must be booked, this kind of inspection. We just have 3 centers here in the Algarve that are doing this kind of inspection. After the car goes to the inspection, then it's just the bureaucratic service. First go to the customs, then the process go to the IMT, then comes again to the customs, then goes to an IMT, and then to the registration. At the final, it goes to you receive the registration at your house. These are taking, even with COVID-19, these are taking about 1 month, the whole process. When we have all the documents, this is quite simple. The problem is sometimes when we don't have the necessary documents to do the process. Now, let me see. Now I will speak regarding the driving license. I don't know why, but I would like to show. Oh, okay. So, exchange the driving license. After you become resident in Portugal, you can exchange the driving license or just make the registration of the driving license. To exchange the driving license is needed the original driving license, the identification card or the passport, the fiscal number, the proof that you are resident. This is that document that Edwina spoke regarding that you get from the council, and the medical form. To get this medical form, first you must request the number of the public health center, okay? Without going to the public health center and get your ID cartão do utente, it's not possible the doctor give you this medical form. Now, because with COVID-19, we have to book with MT, and the client must go because they need to see the person and take a photo and sign the forms. Or if you don't want to exchange the driving license, you just can do the registration of the driving license. The only difference here is you do not need the medical form, so you do not need to have your cartão do utente. Because of the Brexit, what I'm recommending is to exchange the driving license, because we don't know what will happen then after December, so it's better to exchange the driving license. However, the Portuguese driving license are taking about 1 year to come. If the client needs to drive away from Portugal, we can request always international driving license, and you can drive in any country with the international driving license, and they give you in 2 days. It's really something quite straightforward. And that's it.
Okay,
Hello?
thank you. Thank you. I've got one question here for you.
Yes.
Somebody here would like to import an electric car from France to Spain and wonders whether they still have to pay import duty or whether there's any tax to pay.
No. If it is electric, just the registration costs, no tax. The tax is exempt because it's electric. just have to pay the registration, so the full process will be around €200 for registration and inspection.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and Celia, and thank you for sharing that information with us. Okay, so the final section is now with Robin Haynes of Currency Index. So let me just move across to him, and I will hand the screen over to you, Robin.
Thanks, Nigel. Hello, everybody. I'll just try to share my screen as well. Bear with me a second.
Right, and well, over to you.
Okay, does that all look all right? Good, yes. So just a 10-minute chat for everybody through exchange rate risks and how to manage your currency transfers when you're buying and moving to Portugal. It's something that's often overlooked until the last minute when you're buying property and making the move with all the various things that you've got to consider. But I think, as a couple of the previous speakers pointed out, it is a very important factor and can make a huge difference to your budget and what funds you have available. So it's something you don't want to get wrong, something that most people only do once. So it's important to consider it early on in the process and make sure that you're managing your inevitable exposure to the currency markets when making any move. So the subjects we'll cover very quickly are the general volatility in exchange rates and the difference that makes to your budget. A little bit about Brexit, particularly becoming a more and more topical issue as the end of the year creeps ever closer. A little bit about security of funds, which is obviously important when you're moving large sums of money around between countries. And then a brief introduction to the different processes and how moving money with a currency broker compared to using a bank differs. So for volatility, it's inevitable, as I say, that you're exposed to moving exchange rates when you move abroad. The market is constantly moving, and you may not realize if you haven't looked at exchange rates, but the movement in one day can be 1% quite easily, up or down in any particular currency pair. So that can make quite a big difference if you're moving a large sum. A 1% swing can easily be a 4-figure sum up or down each day. So it's something that is frustrating that you have to deal with a very volatile and complex financial market. Things that cause these movements typically will be economic data, political news, and worldwide events. And obviously, in recent times, the unprecedented coronavirus crisis has also been affecting exchange rates, and that's not something anybody would have predicted a few short months ago. So just to give you an idea, over the last 12 months, we've seen the pound against the euro at its peak around 1.2, which was back in February, and at its lowest was last summer, just before Theresa May resigned, I believe, down at about 1.08, when it looked like the initial Brexit deal wasn't even going to happen. So just in the last 12 months, it has been an extremely volatile 12 months, even by any standards, really, with Brexit talks, a general election, a new Prime Minister, and a global pandemic. So we hope that we won't have quite so many seismic events next year, but I think it's not out of the realms of possibility. Just to give you an idea of the difference that makes to a typical property purchase of around 200,000 euros. Obviously, you can multiply these amounts if you were moving lock, stock and barrel and actually moving to Portugal. You may be taking larger sums than this. If you're just buying a property there to start with, it may be less, but just to give you a flavour, the general election in December obviously delivered a Conservative majority, which wasn't particularly expected to be as big as it was. And without making any political comment at all, one thing that you can be sure of is that financial markets do like certainty. So a hung parliament would have probably been very bad news for the pound. Any majority with a stable government that's able to make decisions gives certainty. And as a result, in December, around the time of the election, we saw the pound increase by about 2.5 cents against the euro, making that typical property £3,500 cheaper. Similarly, when the initial Brexit agreement went through in January, which was not quite down to the wire, but was never a guaranteed event, again, certainty. We knew we were going to be in a transition period for 12 months. That gave the market some confidence in the pound. The pound went up, and your typical property there became £5,000 cheaper. Unfortunately, on the flip side, March, when we entered lockdown, which was a very sudden event, particularly in the UK, it came up very quickly with very fast-moving events and shut down most of the economy in the UK. Obviously, markets didn't like that. The pound fell significantly over those weeks towards the end of March and early April, dropped actually 9.5 cents. So that typical €200,000 property was suddenly £14,000 more expensive. So that just gives you an idea of the sort of effect these events can have on your budget and your funds that you're going to end up with if you're moving, retiring, or just buying in Portugal. Coming up, unfortunately, we have another big event that is the Brexit trade talks, which are allegedly going on at the moment. There are not many positive noises coming out of either side for those talks at the moment. Obviously, for everybody moving abroad, we hope there's a resolution to this by the 31st of December, and we hope that you might have a trade deal in place. If that happens, I'd certainly expect to see the pound go shooting up. That might give you some excellent exchange rates towards the end of the year and into next year. Sorry, this is sounding a bit like a weather forecast, but it is about that, certain and uncertain. The other side, of course, is if you're not confident that there's going to be a long-lasting full trade deal done with the EU before the end of the year, that is very likely to keep the pound under significant pressure. And that's what we've been seeing in recent weeks as well, with the pound sort of running along at quite low levels. And I think it's a big gamble to take if you expect a trade deal to be done and exchange rates to shoot up later on in the year. Obviously, that may happen. It's not beyond the realms of possibility, but most of our clients at the moment are urging on the side of caution and expecting that the pound will probably not do very well during the last quarter or 4 or 5 months of the year, simply because the trade talks are not going well. There don't seem to be good noises coming out of either side, and if we are going to end the transition period on the 31st of December without a trade deal in place, then really we don't know what the economic impact of that is going to be in 2021. So we'd expect the pound to, I'm afraid, continue to be under significant pressure. So the other points with Brexit to consider are, if we're out of the EU, is it going to be harder to move money around? Is it going to be harder to send money to Portugal? Is it going to be more expensive to make bank transfers between countries? The answer to that, we are fairly sure, is no, it will be the same as it is now. The UK is already signed up to remain in the SEPA zone, which is the Single European Payments Area, which means that moving money between the UK and EU countries shouldn't have any additional barriers placed on it. So it should be just as quick and simple to move money between the UK and Portugal as it is now. Obviously, the exchange rate may not be great, but the actual logistics and physical requirements needed to move money shouldn't be any more difficult than they are now. Just quickly to cover security as well, in terms of moving funds when you're buying abroad. You may have large sums of money flying around between different countries, companies and banks, and it's always advisable to do your homework. As a currency broker, currency index is regulated by the FCA in the UK and is UK based, and it's recommended that you do your homework with any currency broker you're speaking to, make sure they are properly regulated. I'd recommend only using a UK based company if you're based in the UK, simply because you know the procedures in the UK, you know that you can complain to the financial ombudsman, you know how business is done in the UK. And there are companies that operate and are regulated in other jurisdictions that may not have equivalent safety and security in place. There are several other things to be careful of when moving money abroad, whether you use a broker or your bank, to watch out for. Increasingly, particularly during lockdown, fraudsters have been intercepting and hacking emails exchanged between property buyers and their agents and lawyers. So I'd always recommend, if you receive payment details from your lawyer or from your property agent or anybody by email, do always ring on a verified number that you know and check the details are legitimate before you instruct any payment through your bank or currency broker. We've had examples where lawyers' email accounts have been hacked and fraudulent payment details have been passed on to clients who have then passed them on to us. Thankfully, with the security processes we have in place, we've spotted and stopped those payments, but it is an increasing fraud to be aware of. When you're sending and receiving payment details by email, always verify them verbally by phone, and that's the same whether you receive an invoice or an email. Just copy and paste it into your inbox. Do make 100% sure that before you press a button to send money, that all the details are correct. Other than that, using a currency broker is very safe and secure. It's a regulated industry in the UK, so as a payment service provider, we have to have quite a lot of capital in the business. We have to have robust systems, processes and procedures to check and verify everything that we do in terms of looking after client money. And in addition, you do have recourse to the financial ombudsman in the UK if you're not happy with any regulated currency company's behaviour. Processes and procedures when you're using a currency broker are fairly straightforward. It's not a frightening process to go through. You should have a good high level of service from a reputable currency broker, and ideally one point of contact to look after you from start to finish. There'll be all sorts of new terminology. If you're moving money abroad for the first time, then you'll have things like an IBAN, which is an international bank account number, SWIFT codes, which are like an international sort code. You'll have to do your research on receiving and remitting charges between banks, and know the limitations around using things like bankers drafts internationally, which can cause delays and extra charges. So there's a whole new kind of vocabulary that you'll come across when moving money internationally, and if you're talking to a friendly, experienced currency broker, they'll have very good knowledge of all these things and make sure that you have all the information you need to ensure that you don't fall foul of any unnecessary charges or delays. So it's always a good idea to speak to a currency broker early on in the stages of looking to buy abroad, perhaps 3 or 6 months even before you're looking to go on viewing trips and look at areas to buy, because you can start to get yourself familiar with exchange rates and familiar with all the different processes and things that are needed, rather than leaving this to the last minute, which can cause stress. Obviously, you can still use your bank to move money abroad. That's still what about 50% of people do. There are pluses and minuses to using a bank compared to a broker, and again, you can do your research and make your decision. Banks are obviously high street names. They've been around a long time, but you will tend to find that banks' exchange rates are 3 or 4% below what a typical currency broker can offer you. The banks do tend to use their reputation and the fact that people just walk into a branch and ask them to send money abroad to slip in very poor exchange rates occasionally. So I would always check an exchange rate you're getting from your bank. against that a currency broker can give you, even if you have decided to use a bank. You can still make sure that you're not getting a terrible deal. Obviously, currency brokers are here to provide a better value, and exchange rates can be significantly better. So obviously, I have a vested interest in saying it's better to use a currency broker, but do your homework, check rates, make a comparison, and make sure you understand what you're paying with each type of provider. Exchange rates will have a margin built into them, whoever you use. So if you ring your bank and say, what's the exchange rate to send some euros to Portugal, the rate they give you will have a margin built into it. That's the same if you use a currency broker. So you can very easily compare rates. The cost, therefore, is somewhat included in the rate. So you can't compare a commission rate or a margin that the bank or the broker are making, but you can directly compare exchange rates from one to the other. Banks also tend to be a bit slower. If you go and fill a form in a branch to send money off to Portugal, that form's got to be processed by the branch. It's got to be sent off to head office. Someone's got to process it there. Someone else has to approve it. There's a long process involved. So you tend to find money sent through a bank will take anything up to 3 or 4 days to arrive in the destination account in Portugal. If you use a currency broker, that's all we do. We just send money out for people. So it's very, very quick, and we can usually get money there the same day that you send money to us. So as long as your broker is regulated and you're comfortable using them and they're offering you a good deal, usually you'll probably err on the side of using a currency broker as well. The other thing we can do is offer other options such as a forward contract. That's where you lock into an exchange rate in advance. It's a very useful mechanism when you're buying a property abroad. You've got a payment to make in the future, which could be a significant payment in euros. You don't perhaps have all your sterling yet because you're selling a property in the UK or cashing in some investments or waiting for a pension drawdown. You don't have to wait until you have those funds to lock into an exchange rate. You can use a forward contract to fix a rate up to 2 years ahead. Advantages of doing that are that you know what you're getting, you know what the euros are costing you before you pay for them. If the exchange rate drops in the interim, you'll be very pleased that you fixed your rate. Obviously, if the exchange rate goes up in the interim, you'll wish you hadn't done it. But the main reason most people will use a forward contract is for peace of mind. So you know that you're not going to suddenly find one of these big swings against you between the time of buying a property and paying for your completion. So you know what your property is costing you in pounds and pence. And I think most people say to us, I wouldn't buy a property in the UK if I didn't know how much it was going to cost me. So why would I do that when I'm buying in Portugal? Some people like to take the risk and see if the exchange rate will improve, but most of the time you're trying to protect your budget, you're trying to manage your exposure to those exchange rate fluctuations. So I would always encourage people to consider locking in a rate, particularly if you've got a large amount to move. Or you can hedge your bets, of course, as well, and fix a rate for half of the amount that you know you're going to send and leave the other half rather in the lap of the currency markets. But try not to become a currency speculator. You're moving abroad for the lifestyle, you're moving abroad because it's a move you want to make, and it's very easy to get sucked into trying to second guess the currency markets, which if you're lucky will work out for you, but if you're unlucky can be an expensive surprise when it comes to buying your euros at the end. A little bit about Currency Index. We are a award-winning currency broker. We have lots of nice badges for being nice and looking after people over the years. We try to offer a really good personal service with an account manager to look after you from start to finish. And again, I think that's something that's quite nice when you're dealing with lots of different people. When you're buying abroad, you're dealing with all your finances in the UK. You're dealing with all the new things you're doing in Portugal. I think having one point of contact on hand here that will be an experienced person, knows everything there is to know about currency transfers and takes time to get to know you and look after you is certainly something our clients tell us is valuable. Exchange rates speak for themselves. You can compare our rates, and you should find that we're making you a decent saving if you get quotes from us when the time comes. And of course, that important FCA and HMRC regulation in the UK. So that's just really a very brief overview of looking after your currency exposure when you're moving to Portugal. I appreciate lots of people will want to be getting out this year before we leave the EU. That gives you a little bit of a problem with what's going to happen with exchange rates potentially towards the end of the year. So I'd encourage you to be speaking to currency brokers early on in the process and keeping really up to date with what's happening. Rates can move very, very quickly. So if you're looking to go out and buy later this year, speak to a currency broker early and make sure you're up to date with all the latest information. You don't want to go out viewing with the rates at one level, put the deposit down to take a property off the market and come back and find that the rates dropped because Brexit talks have broken down. So do keep on top of developments. On the other hand, if you're looking at buying next year, potentially the golden visa options or whatever else the government's come up with, again, probably towards the end of this year, start to speak to a currency company and make sure you're on top of things. There may be opportunities in January if the rate may suddenly increase, if it looks like a deal is in the offing. But of course, at the end of the year, we may see lots and lots of volatility. I'm afraid it's very, very hard to predict. So more important than ever to be in touch with some friendly currency brokers. So I'd be happy to take any questions. You can find our details at Currency Index by searching online, and be very happy to help anyone who's watching just chat through what's happening and chat through their requirements.
Many thanks, and Robin. I think we'll now go on to a sort of genuine, general Q&A. So if you'd like to sort of stay on the line.
Okay.
We can sort of do it. I've just got two or three questions here coming in. So one of them, I think, is here about the healthcare system. So it's probably for Lena. Okay, my daughter is type 1 diabetic, and she wants to know if she's exempt from prescription charges in Portugal, and does the same apply to herself, who is over 70?
I do think so, but I would prefer to check that and maybe get back to her. But I do think so, yes.
If she has the cartão do TED, she can go to our public system, and then if she is diabetic, she will be exempt.
Yes.
And with 73 years old, he has the S1, for sure he's a pensionist, so he has access to our public care center. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thanks for that. So then the next one is, if you become a Portugal tax resident in, say, November 2020, will it be taxable on worldwide income only from November, or for the full tax year, even if that's prior to taking up the residency? Gavin, can you take on?
For me, yes, both Portugal and the UK will consider a split tax year, but it will be dependent on the nature of the gain or the income. So income, yes, generally it will be from that date. Gains may be treated slightly differently, so you just need to take specific advice on the nature of the gain, but you can have a split tax year in both.
Okay, thanks. The next one is again a financial one. If I move to Portugal, take up tax residence before the end of this year, and sell a UK principal residence in 2021, will it be subject to UK capital gains? Or?
No, you've got a window both in Portugal and in the UK. Both tax authorities recognise that you may not sell on exactly the date that you want to sell or that you move, and so your principal residence, you do have some time to sell in the UK.
Right. Right. again, Gavin is popular here. We have a house already in the Algarve. If we obtain residency before the end of the year, what are the capital gains tax implications for the sale of our UK residents, which is currently our principal residence? So that's a bit of a repeat.
I think, sorry, Nigel, I think, is that the same question that?
It is, having read it, it's the point you've just covered, isn't it? And this one was, who's the regulating authority for currency brokers? That's the FCA, is it not, Robin?
Yes, that's correct. All of the advisors at Blevins Franks are fully UK qualified, so they'll hold all of the UK qualifications. This year, there's no FCA register of individuals, but you would have seen all of the individuals on the register up to that point. And the FCA is about to produce a new register of individuals. But Blevins Franks as a company, our group office, the overriding regulatory authority is the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK. And they're then further registered and regulated in the countries that we operate in: Spain, France, Portugal, Malta. Yeah.
Okay. And Robin, that's the same, you're FCA regulated, is that the way it works for currency? Could you hear that, Robin?
Yeah, sorry, say again, Nigel.
For currency brokers, are you simply, it's the FCA that regulates you, is that correct?
Yeah, yes, they're the same. So there is a payment, we're regulated under the payment services regulations, and there's a register on the FCA website as well, so you'll be able to find details of any company you're speaking to. Should be on the FCA register as a payment services company if they're handling your money, and that gives you guarantees around the treating customers fairly, how we look after client money, how we safeguard client money when it's with us. So it's very important you don't deal with someone who isn't regulated, because obviously you need all those guarantees when someone's potentially looking after your life savings.
Okay. One final question here. The question comes about mortgages for older buyers. So if you're into your 60s and 70s, are you still able to obtain a mortgage, or what sort of terms are available to you?
For some lenders, 60 is the maximum, but we still have 1 or 2 banks that they can give you until 80 years old. So it's 10 years for borrow a house.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Well, thank you, everybody. I think we'll call it quits at that point, and so thank you all for attending. I will then just sort of finish off with a few minor points before we leave. Okay, thank you. Well, thanks everybody for attending, and just to let you know that a recording will be available next week, so if you want to watch particular sections again to clarify or whatever, please do so. If you have any questions, please send them to me. I will forward them on to the relevant speaker, or we'll find somebody who can answer your questions. If you want to attend an event in Portugal, please register your interest on the site. And once we have a bit more clarity on bridges to Portugal and so on, we hope to set that up, especially for those of you who are looking to move later than this year. There's also on the website, there's plenty of information about moving to Portugal, so please do feel free to take a look at that. But other than that, many thanks to everybody for listening in, and I hope you found it useful. So goodbye, and thank you, everybody.